Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for April 29th, 2022. As it's Friday, I'm taking your questions, and there are actually two primary questions I'm going to address. Many of you have asked, are the war hawks that insane or are they that evil? Well, I'm going to show you that they're both insane and evil. The second question is, how can we stop them? And I'll be taking that up in the second part of today's update. But each day we're seeing the advocates of a global financial and strategic system promoting more provocations against Russia and China and putting us closer and closer to the verge of a war, which would be a nuclear war. I've been covering this, but I just want to review a couple of these more extreme comments to give you a sense of how insane they are. We had the comments from James Heapy, the Armed Forces Minister of the United Kingdom, who said that it's completely legitimate for Ukrainian forces to use British weapons to strike targets inside Russia. That's war. Is that really what he's calling for? Well, obviously it is. Then you had the report I gave you yesterday from Michael Tracy of Tobias Ellwood, the chairman of the Military Defense Committee of the, what's his exact title? Yeah, the Defense Select Committee of the Parliament, where he called for the creation of a coalition of the willing. Doesn't he remember that's what George Bush and Dick Cheney called the forces that went into Iraq on false pretenses in an endless war that ended up creating ISIS and new waves of terrorism? He called for what is essentially a naval intervention against Russia in the Black Sea, once again promoting a broader war. Now, topping it were comments from British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss made 2 days ago at the annual London Lord Mayor's Easter banquet. Easter is supposed to be a time of peace, right? Well, not if you're the would-be Margaret Thatcher of the present-day British cabinet. She titled her talk, Return to Geopolitics. In other words, the doctrine that led to 2 world wars in the 20th century. She wants to return to that doctrine, which is a provocation to break up any potential alliance between Russia, China, and the European countries. She said that what's necessary now, the British intention is to use the war in Ukraine to, quote, reboot, recast, and remodel, unquote, the current security and economic architecture along the lines of the British Empire, the exact opposite of what the Schiller Institute has called for. This will be done through sanctions and war enforced by a global military and economic alliance, which she's calling the Network of Liberty. Now, she said that this should be a war not just against Russia, but China, and not later, but now. She praised the British policy of training and arming Ukrainian troops long before the war started. And she said, now we need a new approach because the UN and G20 have failed because they include Russia. She said, we need a new approach, one that melds hard security and economic security. One that recognizes that geopolitics is back. And then she went completely off the rails. The war in Ukraine is our war, she said. Ukraine's victory is, quote, a strategic imperative that requires ramping up production of heavy weapons, tanks, and airplanes, just what the military-industrial complex wants. And she said, we need to go further. This has to be a catalyst for wider change. We must also apply this tough stance to the threats that are emerging beyond Ukraine, a direct reference to China and Taiwan. Now, of course, this was somewhat the theme that was presented by the Defense Secretary from Raytheon, Lloyd Austin, at Ramstein Air Base a couple of days ago, when he called for more arms, more weapons, and basically strong-armed the Germans into providing anti-aircraft tanks to Ukraine. Biden responded with a $33 billion additional funding package for Ukraine. $33 billion for this war. So you see the evil and lunacy of the war hawks. They're both evil and lunatic, but they must be exposed by you. Now, we have a very useful video that's going to be linked at the bottom of the description page for you to use to organize your friends and co-workers, family, and so on. An interview with Colonel Richard Black, the former state senator from Virginia, who's been with us on occasions in the past, especially exposing the dirty war the U.S. was running in Syria. He was also the former chief of the U.S. Army Criminal Law Division from the Judge Advocate General Corps at the Pentagon. It's a very powerful presentation titled The U.S. is Pushing for World War III. So I encourage you to watch it. But you have to keep something in mind. This is not just military and strategic lunacy. It's directly related to the collapse of the neoliberal financial system, a total systemic collapse which is underway, and the effort by the neoliberal imperial forces to use a great reset to establish a global central bankers dictatorship. That's what's behind the push for war. Now, we've seen the rates of inflation skyrocketing, not because of Putin, but because of the Federal Reserve money pumping, money creating policy. We also saw a drop in the economic growth in the first quarter in the United States by 1.4%, precisely as they're proclaiming the U.S. is back. Now, the war drive against Russia is an attempt to break the potential for a rejection of this collapsing system and a move toward a new financial system along the lines that Lyndon LaRouche has been proposing since 1971. The idea of Russia and China working together, which was consolidated on February 4th in their consultations, is the way to go. And it's not just about a gold-backed ruble. It's about physical economy driving the financial sector rather than the financial sector and speculative swindlers from a criminal cabal destroying the physical economy to loot more wealth from it. The realignment underway represents a real alternative, a return to American system economic policies. And this is what we drafted recently, and this will also be linked at the bottom of the description page, the LaRouche plan for a new international economic architecture. The two things, an economic architecture and a strategic architecture, were the central focus of the April 9th Schiller Institute conference. Now, what we've seen is a decoupling of the financial sector from the physical economy. So some people are making tons of money, but what kind of money is it? It's funny money. It's fiat money. It has nothing backing it up. And the rest of the world is being told they have to give up their food. They have to give up their raw materials. They have to give up cheap labor to back the proceeds that are being created by the money printing of the central banks to keep the banks in business. In reality, the financial system and the economy is bankrupt. It's overloaded with unpayable and uncollectible debt. Pumping more money into it can make it look liquid. That is, that the books will be able to keep the artificially inflated values on the bank's books. But what does that represent? Nothing physical. We're seeing a collapse of the physical economy. 1 billion people in the world facing food insecurity, the breakdown of the supply chains, the shutdown of industry, the Green New Deal, which is part of the Great Reset. All of this is collapsing the physical means for sustaining the world's population. And because countries are breaking with it now, not just Russia and China. The fact that Russia and China are breaking is important because they're the two most powerful countries besides the United States. And you need that kind of power to break from the blackmail and the military might of the US and NATO. But the question is, why is the US continuing to support this? The American system is a rejection of empire, a rejection of colonialism. It was based on the Hamiltonian economic policies, which made the United States an economic superpower of physical production. Russia and China are moving in that direction, and joining them now are countries such as India, Pakistan, Algeria, Brazil, Argentina, Nigeria, and South Africa. This is what was done with the BRICS Bank. This is what's represented by the Belt and Road Initiative of China. It would be natural for the United States to join this instead of supporting wars designed to degrade the Russian economy and a war over Taiwan to attack the Chinese economy, which could easily lead to the nuclear war annihilation of humanity. So, what do? There's no simple solution. It's not a question of do this, do that, and it'll happen. It's necessary that we have a section of the population in the West that studies these issues, studies LaRouche's economic policies, and comes to realize that these policies not only will work, but are the alternative to an otherwise depression collapse that will increase the danger of global war. So you have to become an advocate for LaRouche's policies. Now, don't take my word for it, study it. Read through the pamphlet that we're linking at the bottom of this page, and then watch Colonel Black as he discusses the insanity of the present security policy of the United States. I think many of you who are listening to this agree with us on this. Some of you disagree about the idea of the British. Well, you're wrong about that. All you have to do is look at the role that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are playing in the provocations against Russia and China, and it's clear that the British Empire may not exist as the deep sea navy of the end of the 19th, early 20th century, but the City of London, linked to Wall Street and Silicon Valley, is controlling economic policy, strategic policy, and the narratives that are being pumped out to brainwash your friends and neighbors. So join us as a counter to that. That's the way we can fight this and win. We have the constitutional means to put the United States through a bankruptcy reorganization using such legislation as Glass-Steagall legislation, setting up Hamiltonian credit institutions that provide cheap credit not to speculators to maintain bloated values of artificial financial instruments, but to create credit that goes to scientific and technological development, upgrading the productive power of labor, and creating a much higher rate of real economic growth as opposed to paper growth. So that's what's at stake here. I'm calling on you to join us to become part of this new realignment, bring the United States in as part of the nations that once and for all reject the British imperial tradition and return us to our real tradition as an anti-colonial force for good. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again on Monday.